there, beautiful people. Today I'll be covering Senator Kirsten Gillibrand. She's running for president for the year 2020. And as always, well, not always, only did this one time before. But for the second time around, I'll be covering the good and the bad about her. I'll try to get a little bit more in depth with her. She's pretty, she's a complicated character. Now I'll start with the good. She voted against all but two of Trump's cabinet nominees. She's only voted with the administrative positions, the administration's positions, 7.1% of the time. That's the lowest rate of any of her Democratic colleagues. That includes Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. She supports raising the minimum wage. She's for legalizing weed. She's for a federal jobs guarantee. Good, good, good. She rejects corporate PAC contributions. She voted for the GM bailout that saved a lot of jobs. That's great. She voted against the big bank bailouts, which is pretty amazing since their fraudulent activity is what crashed the economy in the first place. And not many Democrats or Republicans, a lot of politicians just weren't willing to go against them. She voted in favor of regulating subprime mortgages. Again, illegal activity from Wall Street when they were approving people for way more than what they could be approved for, and kind of wrestling these people into debt and eventually out of their homes, which is why we had the subprime mortgage crisis. She supports the free college bill that Bernie put forth. She's for Medicare for all. She's for the importation and renegotiation of drug prices. Again, a very good one. Healthcare is just like on the top of the list of on or near the top of the list. It's definitely one of two. One more than likely being our foreign policy and how we go crazy in war. But I digress from that. Now remember when I said she doesn't take corporate PAC money? It's more complicated in her case, but I'll get to that. I'll get back to that. So I think it's important to cover her past and kind of where she came from. Not her whole story, but her political past. Because nowadays, and it's a good thing, it's good to look back on politicians, see where their stances are, and see where they are now, especially when they haven't been clear in how they've changed their stances. So, as far as Kirsten Gillibrand, she started back in 2007 in the House, and she was much more conservative back then. She was what they call a blue dog Democrat, which are Democrats that are pretty much basically Republicans. You have your Joe Manchins, your Claire McCaskills, even though she's not there. And she had an A rating from the NRA back then. She was against protections for sanctuary cities. The Human Rights Campaign gave her the lowest rating of any Democrat in New York in Congress for her positions on gay rights issues. Now, all those positions seemed to change when Hillary Clinton left the Senate and Gillibrand was appointed to that seat. Her NRA rating dropped to an F as of December 2017, and she was the 7th most liberal member of the 46-person Democratic caucus. Pretty good. Now, when asked why she changed her positions, she said that after being appointed to the Senate, she went down to Brooklyn to meet with families who had suffered from gun violence and immediately felt her positions were wrong, and that prior to that she was only seeing through the lens of upstate New York, which is, to be fair, more conservative. Now look, it's hard to measure sincerity, so I won't try. But I will say without a doubt that this was a political calculation, because being a senator means that you need support in the way of votes from the entire state. New York City has the highest population of people in the state, so it makes sense to pander to that demographic. It just makes sense. And with her being calculated, I believe she will move further to the center of her presidential campaign as a way of playing into what she believes to be the largest voter bloc in the country. But that's just my guess. Now granted, she's made strong stances to the left that are good, but she did meet with Wall Street executives right before announcing her candidacy to gauge their support for her running. Now, according to Open Secrets is a website you can go to and find out how politicians are funded It's a great tool to use. Um, I use it a lot. Find out where all the big money's coming from. Now, according to Open Secrets, a significant portion of the money she's funded has come from the securities and investment industry, most of which are Wall Street firms. In the 2018 cycle, she received more than $1.84 million from individuals and PACs within the industry. And that segues us into the bad. Okay, so in the past, she supported cutting the public debt in half over a 5-year period. Sounds like a good idea, but it's always at the expense of the middle class and poor. I will honestly be waiting on her to make a case on how she intended or intends to do so before placing this in the good category, because there are ways to cut the debt. We have a lot of wasteful spending, but she didn't. I don't believe she was clear on it. And if I missed something, of course, there's a lot of information out there that would prove me wrong. But she needs to be more clear in how she intends to cut spending, because that's usually a talking point from the Republican Party. And whenever they do it, they like to cut what they call entitlement programs, which is Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. But that's neither here nor there. That's something she said in the past, and I'm not sure if she still has that stance. She originally supported the anti-BDS bill, which is just an attack on First Amendment rights. Let's call it what it is. It tells businesses that you can't get a government contract if you boycott Israel. That's dumb. It's dumb. So we can boycott our own government in a ton of different ways, but not a foreign one. But I digress. She doesn't support it anymore after a lot of backlash. She voted for retroactive immunity for the telecom companies that were spying on the American people. It's like being pro-NSA, which violates the Fourth Amendment in a lot of ways. She supports the death penalty. Now, at least 4% of the time we kill innocent people with the death penalty. There are racial disparities. So even to those that support it, know that it's not implemented fairly or properly. If we're 4% of the time, if we're executing the wrong person 4% of the time, that's an innocent person that we're just killing. You need to think about that. So the death penalty, like I said before, it's just not implemented fairly or properly, even if you do subscribe to that way of administering punishment. Now, only 32% of her funding comes from small donors. Now, remember, she said she wasn't taking any corporate PAC money, and that's good. That's great. But there's this thing called big money bundling, where they have these big dinners where they invite big money individuals that work for the big companies like Wells Fargo, JP Morgan Chase, Citibank, Wall Street people. And they pay whatever amount per plate. Most pay the max individual donation. That's $2,700. And when it's done, she keeps what was made at the dinner to put towards her campaign fund. Now, these aren't just people just coming of their own free will, like, oh, I like her, let me go and buy a plate for $2,700. This is not the case. These people are sent on behalf of the companies they represent. And when you're buying a plate and you're giving money, you're buying yourself access. That's wrong on its face. That automatically means that those people have more access than her constituency, which is undemocratic and a big problem, and can show you what influences a lot of her votes. Now, make no mistake, she is a corporate Democrat, but one of the better ones by good measure. And like I said before, I was really surprised at her record. She has bad things, not as bad as I expected, and she has some really good things. So do with that information what you will. Until next time, later. Hello there, beautiful people. Today I'll be covering Senator Kirsten Gillibrand. She's running for president for the year 2020. And as always, well, not always, only did this one time before. But for the second time around, I'll be covering the good and the bad about her. I'll try to get a little bit more in depth with her. She's pretty, she's a complicated character. Now, I'll start with the good. She voted against all but 2 of Trump's cabinet nominees. She's only voted with the administrative positions, the administration's positions, 7.1% of the time. That's the lowest rate of any of her Democratic colleagues. That includes Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. She supports raising the minimum wage. She's for legalizing weed. She's for a federal jobs guarantee. Good, good, good. She rejects corporate PAC contributions. She voted for the GM bailout that saved a lot of jobs. That's great. She voted against the big bank bailouts, which is pretty amazing since their fraudulent activity is what crashed the economy in the first place. And not many Democrats or Republicans, a lot of politicians just weren't willing to go against them. She voted in favor of regulating subprime mortgages,